Welcome, dear viewers. A heartfelt welcome to all of you on the World History Flow channel. Here, we present the true events of history that have been swept away by the flow of time. Unknown stories, lost civilizations, and moments that changed the world, in simple language and in the rhythm of stories. If you love history and want to know the secrets of the past, then this channel is for you. Let's start today's history story.
The air in Plymouth was thick with the scent of brine, damp wool, and the metallic tang of fear. For many standing on the edge of the old world, this was not a journey towards something, but a desperate flight from everything they knew. William Brewster watched as the last of the heavy oak barrels were rolled into the hold. The Mayflower was a merchant vessel, never intended for the weight of 100 souls and their dreams of a new Jerusalem. She groaned against the pier, her masts swaying like skeletal fingers against the overcast sky. There was no cheering, only the low murmur of prayer and the sharp rhythmic barking of Captain Jones's orders. The saints, seeking religious purity, stood shoulder to shoulder with the strangers, those seeking land or a fresh start. These two groups, bound by necessity but divided by conviction, looked back at the receding shoreline of England with a mixture of grief and resolve. As the gangplank was raised, the finality of the wooden thud echoed in the pits of their stomachs. The sails, stained by years of salt and sun, unfurled with a thunderous snap, catching a brisk easterly wind. The shore began to shrink, the figures on the dock dissolving into the gray mist, until there was nothing left but the vast, hungry expanse of the North Atlantic.
The Atlantic was not a bridge, it was a battlefield. By October, the autumnal gales arrived with a ferocity that turned the Mayflower into a splintering toy. Huge white-crested swells, taller than the ship's masts, crashed over the deck, sending torrents of freezing seawater into the living quarters below. The passengers were confined to the 'tween deck, a space barely 5 feet high, where the air grew thick with the stench of seasickness, unwashed bodies, and the terrified bleating of goats. During one particularly violent storm, a terrifying crack echoed through the hull. The great main beam had bowed and split under the pressure. Panic flared like a wildfire in the dark. Men scrambled with a large iron screw, a piece of equipment brought for house building, to jack the beam back into place. It was a moment where the spiritual and the mechanical merged. While the men strained against the iron, the women sang psalms over the roar of the wind. Elizabeth Hopkins, heavy with child, clutched the side of a bunk as the ship pitched violently. In that darkness, the boundaries between the saints and strangers began to blur. They were no longer two factions. They were a single gasping organism trying to survive the indifference of the ocean. In the height of the most terrifying gale, a miracle of life emerged from the shadow of death. Elizabeth Hopkins went into labor as the ship groaned in a rhythmic, agonizing pulse. There was no privacy, no clean linens, and no silence, only the howling wind and the rhythmic thumping of the hull against the waves. Her husband, Stephen, braced himself against the bulkhead to keep her from being thrown across the cabin. When the cry of the newborn finally pierced through the sound of the storm, it felt like a defiance of the elements. They named him Oceanus. He was the first of their number to belong neither to the old world nor the new, but to the transition itself. The birth of Oceanus Hopkins provided a brief, flickering candle of hope for the weary travelers. If a child could survive being born in the belly of a leaking ship in the middle of a hurricane, perhaps they too could survive what lay ahead. The small, red-faced infant became a symbol of their endurance, a reminder that life persists even when the world seems intent on swallowing it whole. Land ho! The cry from the masthead shattered the morning silence like a bell. After 66 days of gray horizons and salt-crusted eyes, the sight of a thin golden line on the horizon felt hallucinatory. It was Cape Cod. The passengers swarmed the deck, their faces gaunt and pale from 2 months in the dark. They saw not the lush green of a managed English estate, but a wild, brooding coastline of dense pines and scrub oak, backed by dunes that shifted like sleeping giants. But the relief was short-lived. They were hundreds of miles north of their intended destination in Virginia. They were outside the jurisdiction of their patent, standing on a vacuum domicilium, a land where no English law held sway. This realization sparked a dangerous murmur among the strangers. If there was no law, they argued, every man was his own master. The fragile unity they had forged in the storms began to fracture. They were staring at a wilderness that could either be their sanctuary or their graveyard, and they realized that before they stepped onto the sand, they had to invent a way to live together without killing one another. In the flickering light of the great cabin, the leaders, Bradford, Brewster, Carver, and Standish, called a meeting. They knew that if they dissolved into anarchy now, the wilderness would claim them by New Year's. On a scarred wooden table, they drafted a short, powerful document. It was not a constitution of a nation, but a covenant of a community. It stated that they would combine themselves into a civil body politic and frame just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. One by one, 41 men stepped forward. Some signed with elegant, practiced flourishes, others with the trembling X of the illiterate. By signing the Mayflower Compact, they performed a revolutionary act. They agreed that their authority came not from a distant king, but from the consent of the governed. It was a desperate survival tactic that inadvertently planted the seeds of a new kind of world. As the ink dried, the tension in the ship eased. They had a code. They had a purpose. Now, they only needed to survive the soil. The first scouting parties to leave the ship found a land that was both empty and haunted. They waded through freezing surf to reach the shore, their wool leggings immediately freezing stiff in the November wind. Led by the diminutive but fierce Miles Standish, they trekked through the dunes, finding deserted village sites and mysterious mounds of sand. In one, they discovered woven baskets filled with multicolored corn, red, blue, and yellow kernels they had never seen before. They took the corn, promising themselves they would pay the inhabitants back, a debt they would later honor, but the feeling of being watched never left them. Suddenly, a strange, high-pitched cry echoed from the woods, "Juan! Juan!" followed by a flight of arrows. The Pilgrims responded with the thunder of their muskets, the smoke hanging thick in the cold air. No one was hurt, but the first encounter served as a chilling reminder. This new world was already an old world to someone else. They were intruders in a land that had its own histories, its own spirits, and its own wars. The Mayflower anchored in the distance. Men are chopping down massive trees. The ground is dusted with snow. A large granitic boulder sits at the water's edge. On December 16th, the Mayflower finally dropped anchor in a protected harbor they named Plymouth. It was the site of a former Patuxet village, cleared of trees and blessed with a running brook of sweet water. The landing was not the triumphant scene often painted by history. It was a grim, mechanical slog. The men spent their days in the freezing forest, hewing great oaks and dragging the timber through the mud to build a common house. The women and children remained on the ship, watching the progress from the deck. The sound of axes ringing out against the wood was the heartbeat of the new settlement. Each day, the men returned to the ship, smelling of pine resin and sweat, their hands cracked and bleeding from the cold. They were building a fortress against the winter, but they were racing against a clock they didn't realize was ticking. The general sickness had already begun to whisper through the ship's hold. Rows of sickbeds, a few healthy people tending to many dying ones. Outside, the landscape is a frozen white wasteland, a row of fresh, unmarked graves in the snow. Winter descended with a cruelty they were entirely unprepared for. Scurvy, pneumonia, and the bloody flux ravaged the colony. The Mayflower, once their refuge, became a floating hospital, then a morgue. At the height of the sickness, only 6 or 7 people were healthy enough to fetch wood, build fires, and tend to the dying. William Brewster and Miles Standish became nurses, washing filthy clothes and feeding the weak with a tenderness that defied their rugged exteriors. By February, they were burying 2 or 3 people a day. To hide their weakness from the Native Americans they feared were watching, they buried their dead at night,
leveling the earth over the graves so no one could count how many of them were left. By the time the spring thaws arrived, nearly half of the passengers and half of the crew were dead. Of the 18 married women who had boarded the Mayflower, only 4 remained. The new world was being paved with the bones of the old.
A tall, formidable Native American man walking boldly into the village. The Pilgrims are startled, reaching for muskets. He smiles and speaks in English. In March, as the first green shoots began to poke through the mud, a tall man walked out of the woods and directly toward the common house. The Pilgrims reached for their weapons, but the man didn't flinch. To their utter astonishment, he greeted them in their own tongue. "Welcome, Englishmen." This was Samoset, who had learned some English from fishermen further north. Days later, he returned with another man named Tisquantum, or Squanto. Squanto's story was a tragedy that mirrored the Pilgrims' own. He was the last survivor of the Patuxet tribe, having been kidnapped years earlier and taken to Europe, only to return and find his entire village wiped out by plague. He spoke fluent English and, seeing the desperate state of the settlers, chose to become their guide. He showed them how to plant corn by burying 3 small fish with the seeds to fertilize the sandy soil. He taught them where to tread for eels and how to find the herring run. Without Squanto, the story of Plymouth would have ended that spring. A great feast, long wooden tables outdoors, Pilgrims and Wampanoag men sitting together, piles of deer meat, roasted wild turkey, baskets of corn and squash, warm, golden autumn light. By October 1621, the colony had transformed. The houses were sturdy, the storehouses were full, and the air was crisp and sweet. Governor Bradford declared a period of rejoicing. They fired their muskets in a salute of joy, which brought Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag, to their gates with 90 of his warriors. It was not a planned Thanksgiving in the modern sense, but a 3-day diplomatic feast. The Wampanoag brought 5 deer to the celebration, adding to the wild turkeys and waterfowl the Pilgrims had hunted. They ate together, men who spoke different languages and held different gods, but who shared a hard-won peace. For a brief window in history, the violence of conquest was paused by the necessity of friendship. They wrestled, they ran races, and they ate until they were full, a luxury they hadn't known for a year. It was a moment of profound humanity in a world that had tried so hard to break them. The ship sails away back toward England. The remaining 50 settlers stand on the beach, looking not at the ship, but at the houses they have built. The sun is setting behind them, casting long shadows toward the west. In April, the Mayflower finally prepared to return to England. Captain Jones offered a free passage to any settler who wanted to give up and return home. Not a single person took the offer. They stood on the shore, watching the white sails of the ship that had been their only home for months disappear over the horizon. When the masts finally slipped below the curve of the earth, they were truly alone. But they were not the same people who had boarded in Plymouth. They were survivors. They had created a government, forged a peace treaty, and learned the secrets of the soil. The new world was no longer a dream or a map. It was the dirt under their fingernails and the breath in their lungs. They turned their backs on the ocean and walked toward their small, hand-built village. The beginning of the new world was not found in the discovery of land, but in the decision to stay. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. If you like this history story, then be sure to like it, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the World History Flow channel for more such history stories. You can share your opinions and questions in the comments. Your comments are the inspiration for our next story. See you again with another chapter of history. Until then, stay well, stay healthy. Thank you.